So good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar Series at the Open University. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a senior lecturer in economics here at the OU. And for the last seminar of the IKD series this year, we are delighted to have with us today a very interesting panel of experts, Anjana Thampi, Irene Selwaness, and Ece Kocabıçak. They all will adopt an intersectional approach to explore the relationship between gender inequality and capitalist development. They will critically engage with the views of development economists through the analysis of three very interesting case studies: India, Egypt, and Turkey. And through these case studies, they will demonstrate that the gendered patterns of wealth accumulation, unpaid care work, and state formation have significant roles in shaping the trajectories of capitalist development. So I'm going to quickly introduce the speakers more in detail. So Irene Selwaness is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University in Egypt. She also worked as a research fellow in the Equity and Social Policy program at ODI London. So her paper will be about the care economy in Egypt, recognizing and redistributing unpaid care work. Anjana Thampi is a Fulbright Callan postdoctoral researcher at the Political Economy Research Institute, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School in India. So her paper is on gender and the reproductive of wealth inequality in India. And then finally, our own Ece Kocabıçak, who's a lecturer in sociology at the Open University, and she obtained her PhD in sociology from Lancaster University, and she will present on engendering the developmental state evidence from Turkey. So just a very few housekeeping rules. We are recording the video, and it will be available for playback after. So people who don't want to be featured in the Q&A sections, they can also ask to remain anonymous and just ask their questions in the chat box. You're being automatically muted, but please raise your hands if you want to ask questions. And please follow us on Twitter at handler is int_OU. I think Craig will put the address in the chat box. So we'll start with Dr. Selwaness. Unfortunately, she will have to leave around 3, so we'll give her an immediate opportunity to give us an immediate opportunity to ask questions right after her talk. So without further ado, I think Irene has some slides, so I will I will put myself on mute and put my camera off so that you have the floor. Thank you very much, all, and please, Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lorena, for the introduction. I'll be sharing my screen right away. So do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Let me do the timer so that I don't take long. So in this presentation, I will going to talk about unpaid care work. But before going to the presentation directly, I want to contemplate a little on the female labor force participation. Development theories, many development theories stipulate that it will going to fall, then rise with economic development, right? So here are some female labor force participation from around the world, from around regions in the world, and we can see this development theory kind of being seen in Central Europe and the Baltics, in Latin America and Caribbean, like some countries, some other countries. But then Why is female labor force participation is kind of the lowest in the Arab world or the Arab states? And if we look at the purple line, it's Egypt. We kind of see that also female labor force participation is as low as in the Arab world, but it's also has been declining in the recent years. And I argue in this presentation that gender differences in labor market outcomes and unpaid care work are two sides of the same coin. Now, this presentation is basically based on a chapter report that I prepared along with Iman Helmi from the World Bank in Egypt. And this chapter report was published in the UN report on the progress of women in the Arab states, the flagship report for the care economy for the UN women. That was in 2020. So the research question for this presentation is how severe is Egypt's gender inequality in unpaid care work? And what are key social and economic factors that can explain this current situation? This is actually to understand how far Egypt is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which calls on improving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls by recognizing and redistributing of unpaid care work and promoting women's employment. We use the most recent kind of data source, and there is no time use survey in Egypt that we can rely on to calculate unpaid care work. So we use labor market panel survey, which has a specific module on unpaid care work, not as a time survey, but rather asking people around roughly how many hours they put in separate activities. But then we need to first go to the outline. So I'm going to tackle three parts. First is to recognize unpaid care work. What is unpaid care work? Who shoulders unpaid care work? Is it a rigid responsibility? And how marriage and family structure come to play with unpaid care work? The second part would be around the key social and economic factors that limit redistribution of unpaid care work. And the third would be around policy recommendations to achieve SDG 5. First, what is unpaid care work? So unpaid care work is actually all care work, whether direct care work or indirect care work. Direct care work, it's all the face-to-face and relational care performed within the household for children, for elderly, for the disabled and the ill. So that to maintain a kind of the human reproduction or the human production, right? The human productivity. And the indirect care work, it's all the activities performed within the household to support the direct care work. For example, the housework, the cooking, all the kind of maintenance around the house. Now, there is a paid care work component, which is in the labor market. So the paid direct care work, it's all the paid employment in education, in health, in social care, and the paid indirect care work, it's basically the paid employment in domestic work. Now, we see that as of 2018, 88% of working age women, which is 15 to 64, reported being involved in domestic and unpaid care work. This is extensive margin. They only say, yes, I do domestic unpaid work in my household, right? Whereas only 29% of men reported being involved. So this is the gap at the extensive margin. Now, the figure shows the intensive margin, which is the number of hours per week. So on the left, there is the chart for women, and on the right there is a chart of men. And the dashed purple line is actually the average number of hours per week dedicated to unpaid care work, whether direct or indirect, both together. So women's unpaid care work basically is 24 hours per week, whereas that of men is 2 hours per week. So we can say that the gap is like 12 to 1. Women's unpaid care work is 12 times that of men on average. But this is pretty much underestimated. 24 is underestimated because it's coming from labor market survey. If Egypt would have had a time use survey, that would be around, I guess, in the 30s or even 40s, but the trends are the same, so we can rely on that. So the comparative trend between women and men will remain constant, even if it's underestimated or so. Now, if we distinguish between non-employed women, unemployed women, and unemployed men and employed men, we will see that the non-employed women dedicate 19 and 5 hours, so 24 hours of unpaid care work. But then the employed women, on top of their paid care work, paid work, sorry, they dedicate 38 hours in the market because they work. This is the total hours of paid work, not necessarily care like in any sector, but then they dedicate 25 hours of unpaid care work as well. So whether employed or non-employed, women dedicate the same amount of unpaid care work. And this makes that employed women work 63 hours per week of total work in the labor market and in her household as unpaid care work. And this is by far the highest number of total work. For men, for example, the employed men work 52 hours of total work. So that means that unpaid care work is kind of rigid responsibility on women's time use, but then this kind of double shift of unpaid care work turns into a second shift. So they do 38 hours of work in the labor market and 25 hours of unpaid care work at households. In the households. Now, marriage, and we are talking about heterosexual marriage. Marriage and family structure are key determinants in unpaid care work. So married women, they spend 41 hours per week, up from 24 on average. So marriage is associated with an expansion in the hours of unpaid care work. It's 7 times what married men actually allocate in unpaid care work. But then we calculated the additional number of hours that result in having a child under 3, a child between 3 to 5, a child 6 to 17 in school, or an elderly. And we find that the highest increase or the highest number of hours, the additional hours of unpaid work, the highest additional hours of unpaid work comes from having one child under 3 in the household, which is actually 9 hours in addition to 41 hours per week, making it peaking at 50 hours. So now we are going to ask, what are key social and economic factors that limit redistribution of unpaid care work? And the first determinant or the first builder is the social norms. I'm giving you a glimpse about social norms in Egypt and in the Arab states like overall. There is a gendered separation, a quite very consistent and resistant gender separation of roles between male breadwinners and female caregivers. Like taking the World Value Surveys, we find that the majority of men and women support the statement that men should have priority in obtaining jobs, but also they agree that being a housewife is as fulfilling as working for pay. Now, taking the Egyptian labor market survey, we find less than half of men supporting male participation in domestic chores. So there is less consensus about male involvement in unpaid care work. The second issue is the mismatch between care needs and care provisions in the market that limit redistribution of some unpaid care work to the market. This reduces women's ability, of course, to buy some of the unpaid care work with money, right? So we used the establishment census in Egypt, the latest one, and we calculated the number of childcare facilities to the number of children age 0-3, since the children age 0-3 and 3-5 are associated with the highest increase in women's time use in unpaid care work. So we find only around 0.19 nurseries for every 100 children aged 0-3. So there is a very kind of deep shortage in nurseries. And this leads to an anemic enrollment rate. We also calculated the enrollment rate. It's 8% for children in this age group. Now, there is also a scarcity of public and private provision of elder care in Egypt. We only counted in census 169 care organization to serve a growing population of 5 million, growing elderly population. The third important factor is the economic development and the labor market and the institutional factor. There is a worsening in women. There are worsening women's opportunities in the labor market. The Egyptian labor market, and actually many of the labor markets in the Arab region, have exhibited structural changes toward a very inhospitable labor market to women. That was through first the austerity cuts and the IMF reforms in the 90s and the 2000s that led to a reduction in public sector jobs. And why is this a problem? Because the public sector jobs tend historically to be very much reconcilable with domestic responsibilities, shorter hours of work, but also very much reconcilable with gender norms because it was a safe workplace, a good procedure jobs with job security, social insurance coverage, formal jobs, maternity leave, so care provisions within this kind of job. Now, there is also many previous research that demonstrated indeed that reducing public sector hiring in past decades has been an important reason of falling rates of women labor force participation and rising fertility, which indeed rise and fuel unpaid care work. The private sector had limited capacity in creating decent jobs, leading to an expansion of informal employment. And this informal employment is often, the working condition of this kind of employment is often below what we call reservation working conditions of women and is a great barrier to the participation. Now, what are potential ways to achieve SDG, since the gender inequality in unpaid care work is that huge? We need to think about what we can do. First, to recognize unpaid care work through better data to inform Egypt SDG number 5. Second, investment in affordable, and I highlight affordable, in high quality care provisions. Third, make the labor market a hospitable place. And fourth, knowing that changing gender norms is not impossible. And if I have the time, I can go through each one. The data gap. Yeah. All right. Perfect.
Yes.
All right. The data gap is really filling the data gap is a really essential step in recognizing and help plans to redistribute unpaid care work. So a national time use in all countries that lack from this kind of gap would strengthen the plans towards SDG 5. But there were also important gaps on childcare facilities, the fee structures, are they public, private, type of nurseries, enrollment pattern, perception of parents, as well as elder care services. Now, investment in high quality childcare and elder care services is very important because this will serve the dual goals of supporting children development if these childcare services would be really nurturing. And it also would enable women to join and remain in the labor force. But investment in childcare and elder care services would also directly provide an opportunity for expanding women's employment because women are very much likely to work in these sectors in Egypt. That's also what our study have shown, but I haven't had the time to go through this. But then the reform, especially on the early childhood and care education, which we call ECCE, should ensure that all children are offered equal opportunities because many previous studies have pointed to great inequality within this regard. And reforms must encourage the private sector to invest in elderly care services through preferential taxation of childcare and elderly both, and then promoting professional nursing to increasing the prestige, how people look at caregivers, but also that will increase the quality of services being provided. And yeah, I have 2 slides to finish. I know I'm beyond the time. Now, the private sector, the labor market is very important. Fixing the labor market, addressing structural problems has to be done. Like the business climate, the access to finance to micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are likely to constitute most nurseries and elder care facilities, but importantly, adopting and promoting gender-neutral policies. Now, care leaves that are only offered to women actually reinforce the prevailing norm that care work is women's work. Like in the contrary, care leaves that are open to all employees may help a little bit changing gender norms, which I'll tackle in the last slide. But also gender-specific regulation that only apply to women should be avoided. It can backlash and disincentivize employer from hiring women. That's the case for the Egyptian law, which actually stipulates that every firm recruiting more than 100 women have to establish a nursery. And this make employers stop at hiring 99 women to avoid establishing a nursery. So if we do a gender neutral policy of like if a firm is like hiring 100 employees instead of women, that will help alleviating a little bit this disincentive. And there is room, of course, to restructure the financing scheme in Egypt for maternity leave have to be paid in full by the employer. So moving towards a maternity insurance system could help a little bit with many kind of other fiscal policies. Now, changing gender role attitudes is not an impossible task. Many studies have, a recent one on Saudi Arabia, have actually demonstrated that it is possible. Involving men in unpaid care work is essential for the redistribution. This would require intensive communication, soap operas, advocacy campaigns, but also gender neutral policies would be useful. And this is reference to the main report behind this presentation, which is a flagship report of the UN Women for the Arab states, and some selected works on women employment in the MENA region and on the labor market in the MENA region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene. Perfect timing. And I think your findings and your policy recommendation resonates in a lot of other countries, including the global north, the so-called global north. But without further ado, because I know that you are leaving soon, I wanted to ask to the participants and attendees if you have any immediate questions for Irene or the panelists. I can actually have a clarification question. Besides that, all sounds very. I completely agree with everything you said. But what is this gender insurance policy? Is it like a kind of financialization story? Is it a market-based solution, or is something that is? I would like to know a little bit more about that. Yeah, I think then.
Should I answer right away? Or?
Yeah.
If I understand correctly your question, is it about the maternity insurance fund?
Yeah. What? Yeah. Yeah. I read at a certain point something about insurance. I know you were like really behaving very well about time management, so maybe I misread the slide, but it was about insurance, like something. Yes.
Yeah, so basically what we found in the Egyptian labor market, that because employers bear the cost of maternity leaves, the 3 months, we have 3 months maternity leaves, that they actually, women in anticipation of their pregnancy quit their jobs, or employers agree with them to quit their jobs before giving birth, just to avoid this additional cost of maternity leave. So one of the recommendation would be, we thought about having an insurance fund for maternity, same as a social contribution. The idea that the employees and contribute towards the maternity fund, maybe in part with the employer and maybe with subsidized from the government, just to make sure that the cost doesn't fall in total on the employer, but is kind of a shared cost. Or maybe, so Jordan has taken steps in this reform. They have implemented maternity insurance fund, but then there is little evidence on how it works and how good it helps in retaining women. Yeah, so that is one of the ideas, and I think some of the countries already do that.
Okay, thank you. Ece, as a question, I think. Yeah. And
yes, Irene, thank you so much for this great publication as well. I read your article recently published in Feminist Economics. It was very impressive. I have a bit of an overall question, actually. I was wondering what do you think about it? There is a significant heterogeneity in terms of female labor force participation in the entire global South. So when we look at the East Asia and Pacific, Latin America and Caribbean, and Southern and Western Africa, there is no gap in terms of labor force participation and access to paid employment in non-agricultural sectors. But when we look at the South Asia, like you said, Middle East, North Africa, and Middle and Eastern Africa, there is a significant gender gap. And these countries are very diverse. They are not necessarily Muslim majority countries like other scholars suggest, or patriarchal norms or attitudes are significantly strong, especially in the some of Latin American countries. And care policies are also diverse. Like in Turkey, they increase public provisioning of care by investing in private sector and applying state provisions, state supports, but it still didn't change the overall picture very much. I was wondering if you have any hypotheses or ideas about the reasons of this heterogeneity.
Thank you, Ece. Yes, Irene. And then we have a question from Françoise. Yes. Should I collect that quickly? Frances, I'm going to try to allow the mic because Craig actually muted all the presenters. Let's see if it works. Just for this, can you?
I've just released permissions, Lorena.
All right, thank you, Greg, because it's a bit complicated to access. Yes. Hi, Francois. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted. Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I wanted to ask about the elderly care because my own experience is in Nigeria, and this idea of elderly care outside, like you have in France or in the UK, is very frowned upon by people. They think that it's equivalent to abandoning your old ones, and it's abomination to them. So I was wondering, why on earth do you want to change that? What are the reasons, and how do you think that you're going to do it?
Thank you. So, Irene, I think you can answer both questions.
Yeah, thank you, Evie. This is a very good question, actually. And this is what many studies have actually been studying over the past years to understand why female labor force participation is kind of very different in different contexts. And I think it has to, like, it's not only economic development. I feel the development theory that say that with the economic development, it declines and then rises again, is not a complete theory, because we have to look at the institutional factors, mainly everything institutional in this country, like the rule of law, like all the institutional context, really. Social norms play a very important role in identifying female labor force participation, and obviously unpaid care work, and to the extent of women's ability to redistribute and finding a nurturing place to their children, to the elderly, etc. So maybe these four blocks together, like economic development, institutional factors, social norms, and unpaid care work, fits together to it's a big question, really, and it would be great to have a study that maybe it's worth contemplating the difference in countries from different regions to understand what really plays, how these mediate female labor force participation and the gender gap. Not sure if I understood, if I answered correctly.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to hear also your assessment. Thank you.
On the second question, yes, Now, there is a stigma, and sometimes it is because of the quality of elderly care services that people would, the elderly would think that it's kind of, sometimes it's not associated with the Western culture. I fully understand that, but then I think there is a shortage in whether residential, we have to distinguish between the residential and the non-residential care services. So the non-residential elderly care services, it would be like sort of a club that the elderly can go on a regular basis, enjoy their times, spend times doing some some activities, like they are active, they connect. I don't see any harm in the non-residential care services, but they do not exist in Egypt. So when I talk about developing elderly care services, I talk about the residential and the non-residential care. But then promoting the quality would very much help the stigma, would very much help mitigate or alleviate the stigma around sending elderly. Because if there are good homes, like there are good care homes, maybe elderly themselves, they would like to go there because they need continuous care. So it's not that they abandon, it's not that we ask women to abandon, or we ask parents to abandon their children or their elderly. Not at all. But we check if if the market can also offer some nurturing experiences for those who are in need for care.
All right. Just I think the last question, because then we have to we need to pass to the second speaker. So Naima, some feminist says that women who can externalize domestic work, so pay someone for it, often reinforce domestic exploitation because they usually pay Black migrant women to do it. I would like to hear your point of view about that. Thank you, Naima.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question, and I think we have to be very bold in reforms about domestic work. Yes, there is a problem, and we don't have to hide. We don't have to hide. Domestic work is usually associated with the lowest, with very vulnerable working conditions. So I think it's the responsibility of the government to first ensure that social security coverage can be extended to all workers, including domestic works, and put regulations for this work to be respected and
regulated,
formalized. But I remember presenting this paper before, and one of the solutions that have been discussed was that like technology would help actually women clean their houses, like the machines, the high-tech appliances and everything like that. So would help actually women to do it themselves, and women and women, and like to do it themselves without need too much domestic work,
Yeah. Very technological optimism, let's see. But yeah, I mean, there is actually very interesting work about the global value chain of care. And yeah, it's a very important topic. And also on digital platform that look at care, I mean, domestic workers. So it's a very relevant question, Naima. All right. So thank you, Irene. That was great. Fantastic talk and a very good umbrella introduction also to see very different aspects of this topic. Now we pass the, feel free to stay as long as you want. And I mean, I know you're very busy, you have to leave, but please stay as much as you want. And yeah, Anjana will now present the case of India. So I'll give you the floor, and I put myself on mute, and thanks a lot.
Thanks, I'll just share my screen.
Yes, we can see the screen, the slides.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks. So thanks to Ece and to IKD for organizing this panel. I'm really happy to be a part of it. So I'm looking at the theme on development in the global south through gender and the reproduction of wealth inequality in India. I'm setting this in the context of the rise in global wealth inequality since the 1980s. And it's been recorded that India is among the most unequal of those countries. But the focus in general of studies on wealth inequality has been on inter-household rather than intra-household inequalities. And that has been challenged by the feminist literature because feminist literature raises that this essentially assumes that assets are equally distributed among the members of the household. So I'm essentially picking up from that literature and looking at the reproduction of wealth inequality and what could explain inter and intra-gender gaps. Specifically, I'm looking at land ownership because this is a central contributor to wealth inequality in India and also partly due to the restrictions of the data that I'm looking at. So the central puzzle that I'm raising is that even though in India we've had progressive legislation on women inheriting paternal family property, even today only 12% of women in India own land as against around half of the men in the country. And as Beena Agarwal and others have pointed out, women as a collective could come together and they could claim their rightful inheritance. So why don't they then do that? And the question that I raise is that, is there a conflict between class, caste, and gender that could explain these gaps in land ownership? And when I say caste, I'm essentially thinking of that form of social stratification that exists in India, which has had historically systematic implications for social and economic well-being in India. Household sample survey data generally tends to capture it in 4 broad groups, but I'm essentially looking at 2 broad groups in the paper, which is the historically disadvantaged scheduled castes, or SCs, or Dalits as they're called, formerly untouchable communities. They were considered untouchables. And other castes, what I call other castes, which is meant to represent dominant caste groups, and that excludes marginalized social communities and Muslims. So it's been well recorded in the literature that there are substantial differences in land ownership between households of the dominant castes and Dalit households. But then if you look at land ownership gender disaggregated data on land ownership, it's generally low for women across caste groups. So it's around 5% among the scheduled castes or Dalit women, and it's around 9% among dominant caste women. So there's some gap, but then generally it's low across caste groups for women. And so I invoke Gerda Lerner's study of the origins of patriarchy, which talks about how women themselves have agency that they may use in ways that actually support patriarchal systems. And the key argument that I'm going to be making in the presentation is that the caste order in India enables the reproduction of the gender order through what's called the mediated class location of women. Specifically, the dominant caste women benefit from the labor of landless Dalit women, and this makes them resist joining them in claiming rights over land. And I look at the official wealth surveys, the All India Debt and Investment Surveys, or ADIS, which didn't until recently collect gender disaggregated data on land ownership. Earlier studies that have looked at women's land ownership have used data which had flaws in certain respects. So this is the first time that the official wealth survey actually collects that. And this seems to be, in a sense, an official recognition of the fact that there are gender differences in the ownership of land. But there are still flaws with that survey in the sense that it does it for land, but not for other assets in the survey. And there are also concerns about household sample surveys that there's undersampling of the top end of the wealth distribution. So I address that partly by using a rich list that's compiled by Hurun India, which basically gives the names of the 100 wealthiest women in the country. And I also supplement this in some ways using the employment survey called the Periodic Labor Force Survey of 2018-19. So to begin with, I'm essentially looking, if you look at the row that's in blue, that's essentially a division of women according to the area of land that they own. So a marginal female landowner is essentially either a woman who doesn't have any land or has less than 1 hectare of land. And small is 1 to 2 hectares, semi-medium 2 to 4, medium 4 to 10, and above that is a large female landowner. So that's the land size classes of women landowners. And then I look at the households that they are residing in for both rural and urban regions. So the one on the left is the rural and the other is the urban. And that 1 to 10 is essentially telling us the wealth decile of that household that that woman is residing in. And so the interesting thing, it's not very surprising that, of course, large female landowners tend to belong dominantly to households in the top 2 wealth deciles, 9 and 10. But if you look at the highlighted cells, and if you add 9 and 10, essentially what it means is that around 20% of marginal landowners, female landowners, belong to households that are in the top 2 wealth deciles. And if you look at small, around 60% of the small female landowners reside in households that are in the top 2 wealth deciles, and that's actually around 80% in urban areas. So what that means is essentially that there are high proportions of women who may not themselves own very large areas of land or perhaps don't own any land, but they reside in households that rank among the topmost wealth deciles. And such women, I would argue, have what Eric Wright called a mediated class location, and they can be seen as different from women who may also own similar areas of land, but belong to less wealthy households. So the idea that Eric Wright raised when he was talking about mediated class location was that the material interests of individuals are not only shaped by their own direct relations to productive resources, but also by their relations to other family members that link them to the capitalist system of production. And so if I look at these women in mediated class locations, do these locations vary by caste? And essentially I'm looking at the social composition of women in ML is referring to women in mediated class locations, and all is essentially the distribution of all women across social groups. And the first 4 rows are essentially representing marginalized social or religious groups. But I would ask you, take a look at the highlighted rows there, which are the 2 broad groups that I'm looking at specifically. So the proportion of dominant caste women in mediated class locations is higher than their share among all women in both rural and in urban regions. 30% of the women in mediated class locations in rural regions are of the dominant caste, the OC caste, even though they actually only account for 16% of the overall population of women. And that's true. 50% of the women in mediated class locations are of dominant caste in urban areas, even though they only account for 30% of the overall population of women in urban areas. Whereas if you look at scheduled castes or Dalit women, only 10% of the women in those mediated locations are Dalits as opposed to their share of 21%. And for urban regions, that's 7 vis-a-vis 16%. And I also find a general homogeneity of the wealthiest when I look at what I mentioned, the Hurun Rich List, which gives the 100 wealthiest women in India. And I find a relative homogeneity for those women whose caste could be identified. More than 80% of them were of dominant castes. And then overlapping caste class identity could actually supersede the gender identity of women in higher class locations. And we need to see that along with the differences in the nature of work of women in these communities. And this is where I'm looking at the activity status as recorded in the employment survey. The principal or the subsidiary activity that women of SC or OC communities are engaged in. And what I find is that a higher proportion of scheduled castes or Dalit women are employed as casual wage laborers, whereas a higher proportion of dominant caste women are engaged principally in domestic duties. There's a gap of, as you can see, around 10 percentage points between these two communities. And also, if you look at a further disaggregated level, and looking at their occupations, we also find that the higher shares of Dalit women are employed in what are called elementary occupations requiring less skill, as noted by the survey, and they're generally employed as agricultural and fisheries laborers in rural areas to the extent of 34%, and as domestic helpers in urban areas. So the argument that I would raise is that dominant caste women also benefit. It's not just the men in these households, the women in these dominant caste households benefit from the agricultural and domestic labor of Dalit women. And this can only continue as long as those Dalit women are landless. And so that could restrain dominant caste women from joining forces in claiming their rights over land. And this hypothesis through household sample survey data can also be related to the insights from field studies. For instance, there's a study of Vallavapuram village of the state of Tamil Nadu, where young Dalit girls are dedicated to sexual slavery and they can only work as agricultural laborers or domestic servants in dominant caste households. And to take another example of a practice in another state of Karnataka, Dalit workers, largely women, perform domestic labor in the homes of dominant caste households. So to conclude, Engels had raised the view that the path to women's emancipation lies in the abolition of private property and the transition to socialism. This account has been critiqued, for instance, by Agarwal, who says that this account does not consider the consequences of women themselves owning private property. And I argue that women's emancipation may also be hampered by the mediated class locations that are occupied by women in landed households, even when they themselves do not own land. Such women tend to belong to dominant caste communities, and they're able to transfer that burden of agricultural and domestic labor onto landless Dalit women. And so let me invoke this quote of B.R. Ambedkar, who said that the untouchables are a body of landless laborers who are entirely dependent upon such employment as the Hindus may choose to give them, and on such wages as the Hindus may find it profitable to pay. This continues because of the economic dependence of the subordinated caste communities. And so despite commonalities that can unite across women, class and caste differences are divisive, as women in relatively wealthy dominant caste households are able to benefit from the assetlessness and the associated economic dependence of the women of subordinated castes. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anjana. And that's a very fascinating case studies and talk, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to discuss further at the end. But I think we're now going ahead with the third speaker. So Ece will present her case study of Turkey, and then we'll have the final Q&A at the end. Ece? Yes?
Hi.
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 So the floor is yours.
Dazzled by Anjana's presentation. I was just thinking and Googling something. Maybe hopefully we can discuss later. And I'm going to share my slides as well. Yes. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. And I specifically like to thank Craig for organizing all these activities and for Lorena to chairing our event today. My research is about the gendered characteristics of the developmental state, and I draw on the evidence that I analyzed from the context of Turkey. I started to think about the patriarchal character of the state a long time ago, but I didn't have time until Turkey announced its withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention, this is the statement, official statement that the Turkish Republic, the government announced. Turkey was the first country to sign and ratify the treaty in 2011, but suddenly and abruptly withdrew from the convention in 2021. The Istanbul Convention is the name of the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. So briefly, it's known as Istanbul Convention. So then I tried to understand why this state decided to withdraw from the convention. And I wasn't satisfied with the current explanations. Current explanations focus on the political strategy of AKP regime, the government rule called Justice and Development Party. I briefly used the name of AKP, their own name. And however, the evidence didn't show that people supported this idea when the withdrawal decision was taken. So when I was trying to understand the patriarchal character of the state, I realized the question of can a state be patriarchal was not addressed and discussed in a detailed way. So firstly, Marxist accounts of the capitalist state are very rich. They understand, they provide a very good analysis of the relationship between the capitalist system, the bourgeois class, and the state, and then how the state hegemony sustains the system actually. And then I read about the Weberian understandings of the state, which emphasize the role of modernization, varieties of modernization, or lack of modernization in sustaining different forms of states. And of course, briefly, when I look at the debate on the developmental state, they rightly emphasize the significant role of state in capitalist development, how the proactive role of the state within the historical trajectory of the global north played a significant role in boosting capital accumulation, and how in the global south, actually, this proactive understanding of state is systematically limited. But none of these studies paid attention to the patriarchal character of the state. I also think that the racist character of the state is not studied enough. And then, briefly, when we look at the feminist debate on the state, initially the debate has significantly focusing on the question of whether the state is a liberating force or inherently coercive, co-opted by the social inequality regimes. Can we work within the state, or we should stay outside of the state? And then this debate evolves in a way that feminist studies focus on the gendered aspects of welfare provisions and policy formations. And then gender-based discriminatory legal codes and penal policies, and political citizenship is discussed in this context. But what I realized that feminist studies tend to dismiss firstly the collective agency of men, different groups of men in shaping state formation. And at the same time, they do not theorize the changes in the patriarchal state characters and perhaps varieties of patriarchal states. States are certainly patriarchal in different countries, including global north and also global south. But for example, the patriarchal state character in Turkey is slightly different to patriarchal state character in the UK. So we need a theoretical framework to understand those varieties as well. So previously, I investigated the global southern context. I tried to understand varieties of patriarchy in the global south and how they diversify the trajectories of capitalist development in those contexts. So in light of my previous study, I realized that actually class, race, ethnicity, and caste, like Anjana mentioned, and gender-based dominant sections of society are capable of developing their collective bargaining, increasing their collective bargaining capacity with the state. And this reinforces multiple state agendas. So, unlike Marxist theories of the state, for example, I do not think that there is only a capitalist agenda that state reinforces. There is also racist state agenda and also patriarchal state agenda. And there is an there's an interplay between these multiple state agendas. And I wanted to test these ideas in the context of Turkey by focusing on the case study of Istanbul Convention. I also realized that drawing on the theories of varieties of gender regime, we can differentiate two major forms of patriarchal state. I call these states like the public and domestic patriarchal state. And I argue that the domestic patriarchal state confines the majority of women's labor to household production, including care work, whereas the public patriarchal state utilizes various degrees of commodification and decommodification of goods and services produced by women within the home to sustain women's double burden of paid and unpaid labor. Like Irene mentioned at the beginning of her presentation, public patriarchal state sustains some sort of double burden and increases women's total working hours. But on the other hand, domestic patriarchal states design social policy framework in a way which confines women's labor into unpaid domestic work, actually. I have also realized that a particular form of family, which I call the cisgender heterosexual family, is constantly reproduced within the social framework. Frameworks, social policies are designed in a way family is constantly protected and reproduced, and alternative forms of families are limited. So public or domestic, both forms of states are patriarchal, and they focus on protecting this particular family structure and gender-based division of labor within the family. And finally, in my previous research, I found that the patriarchal, capitalist, and racist collective subjects in the global south are slightly diverse than the global north. Like theories on uneven and combined development emphasize that in the context of less developed countries, both the capitalist and non-capitalist classes determine socio-economic transformation. So drawing on this idea, previously I found that male small producers in rural and urban areas are effective in shaping social transformation. And with this research, I wanted to test the hypothesis that the condition in which de-democratization increases women's access to political representation and public decision-making, a particular group of elite men whose impact on state formation is much greater than the anti-gender movements in the global north. So I focused these dimensions of my initial findings and hypotheses in this research. I have chosen the case study of Turkey due to a couple of reasons. First of all, Turkey represents an ideal case in which women's labor is confined to unpaid labor in households and rural small production. Like, for example, in 2020, only 29% of paid work, any kind of paid work, informal or informal, are occupied by women. The rest were occupied by men. In addition, Turkey ranks 130th out of 190 countries, so women's access to parliamentary representation is very limited. And these strong patriarchal arrangements intertwined with a persistent aggression towards the non-Muslim and non-Turkish populations. So the capitalist and racist agendas are associated with the patriarchal agenda within the country of Turkey, within the context of Turkey. In addition, the recently established anti-democratic leadership since 2014-15 enables an assessment of the various political actors that have gained power through de-democratization. So this context also allows me to assess the role of men of the regime in Turkey. So I use mixed methods here. I use publicly available databases provided by national and international institutions. And at the same time, I used official text right from the archives of the Turkish state. And actually, I also assessed the social media posts around. I try to understand the discourse of the debate around Istanbul Convention. So in order to do that, I focused on Twitter and Facebook, and I used Encapture, which is a plugin software belong to NVivo, and I ran particular queries in order to assess the social media posts and newspaper articles and press releases. So I think I'm on time. So key findings, first of all, here, what I found is I realized that a shift towards a public patriarchal state in Turkey has remained limited, which means that Turkish state upholds both public and domestic patriarchal states. So on the one hand, it tries to increase women's double burden, sustains women's double burden by specifically focusing on public provisioning of childcare, but at the same time, it restrains women to domestic households. So especially class plays a significant role in this division. Highly educated women are supported by the state in terms of accessing paid employment, but relatively low educated women are encouraged to stay at home and shoulder the care work necessary for children, elderly, or other members of society that they cannot look after themselves. And I also realized that state limits women's access to political representation and public decision making, also restricts women's reproductive rights and sexuality in different ways. And furthermore, it traps women into in the confines of the violent cisgender heterosexual family. Violence is criminalized, domestic violence, but women are not allowed to go out of those violent contexts. So the assessment focusing on economy, civil society, and violence shows me that unlike many countries, mostly in the global north, the shift from domestic to public patriarchal state is blocked in Turkey. And in order to understand why this shift didn't happen, I wanted to focus on the case of Istanbul Convention that I believe it shows me the dynamic interaction between different political actors. So when I look at the case of Istanbul Convention, what I saw was a bit of an interesting environment. The context were more like what I can call the gender wars, actually. There was a war between men and women, irrespective of their class and ethnicity and religious differences. It was a bit interesting context. So my assessment shows that men's rights-based movements against women's rights has two stages. Initially, between the early 2010s and 2018, those men got organized against the different topics like legal regulations prohibiting child marriage, securing alimony. They organized against this, and they organized against regulating custody of the children, and they did their best to fight against women's rights, but they were not successful. They were not successful until 2019. In 2019, these groups of men have increasingly utilized the Turkish Sunni Muslim racist agenda. You can call Turco-Islamic racist agenda as well. They adopted that agenda, and it's not just one-way adoption. They also changed the agenda. There was a mutually shaping relationship between them. And then suddenly, they started to attack Istanbul Convention. Their Facebook posts and Google Trends show that although there was no mention of the Istanbul Convention before 2019, these groups have increasingly attacked this Istanbul Convention and claiming that the convention has been imposed by Western powers and aims to destroy the Turkish family and societal values. And then when I look at the context, I try to see whether or not men of the regime that I call those powerful, strong elite group of men can benefit from the de-democratization, anti-democratization in the country and support these claims. And what I found that men of the regime significantly, they played a significant role in increasing the political negotiation power of other patriarchal actors and increasing their visibility and helping them to access the regime, real leaders of the regime. So first of all, what they did, they portrayed male domination as an essential part of the family structure. And then they argued that the Istanbul Convention is the enemy of family as it provokes women against men. And they reformulated the Turkish Sunni Muslim state agenda on the grounds of biological essentialism. So they argue that the convention draws on the Malthusyan principle of population control, and it's going to destroy the Turkish Muslim population by promoting the same-sex relationships and transsexuality. And by abolishing the categories of men and women, it will totally end the Turkish Muslim population in the world. And in defending this racist state agenda, they even claimed that Istanbul Convention equals to invasion of Turkey by foreign, especially Western powers. So I think this figure represents the reality very well. Like the first one shows Fatih Sultan Mehmet, who got Istanbul from Byzantium Empire in 1453. So he's putting the flag of invasion of Istanbul. But in 2011, someone who is holding European Union hat is invading Istanbul again with Istanbul Convention. So this propaganda portraying West as the enemy of Turkey who wants to invade and ruin Turkey played a significant role in convincing the state. So, in summarize, under the conditions of this patriarchal de-democratization, men of the regime have played a significant role in re-establishing the Turkish Sunni Muslim racist agenda on the grounds of male domination and also biological essentialism, also decolonization. They claimed that they redefined their Islamic principles as an alternative to the Eurocentric methodologies and epistemologies. Ironically, they heavily adopted the Orthodox Church's main theories against LGBTQ members of the society, but they still insist that their circles are alternative to the main Eurocentric knowledge production systems. When we look at the feminist movement, what they have done, actually, women at the beginning, women were organized against Istanbul Convention in order to defend Istanbul Convention. They successfully organized against men of the regime as well as other patriarchal political actors. But since 2019, AKP regime increasingly used the discourse of natural sex and gender division. So according to them, men and women can never be equal because they are biologically different. In their emphasis on nature, they drove on the essentialist perceptions of reproductive roles and responsibilities and stressed that men and women cannot be equal because of their biology. They are different. So this debate on equality versus difference gave rise to two different understandings of gender equality. One group of women and feminist movement defended gender equality between men and women, but the other group, mostly conservative women, they decided to develop the new concept, adopt gender justice concept and develop within the context of Turkey. Unfortunately, this polarized understanding didn't help the Turkish context. So they got divided, women got divided, feminist movement couldn't understand the significance of gender equality, and this division also prevented them from revealing the significance of this particular heterosexual family, understanding of family for the racist agenda of the Turkey. As a result, racism in Turkey is increasingly becoming intertwined with the biological reproduction of the Turkish and Sunni Muslim population. And this increasingly enables patriarchal political actors to reinforce the essentialist notions of sex and gender within society. This devised feminist movement confuses their understanding of gender equality, and at the same time, patriarchal political actors subscribe to this racist agenda, and by subscribing, they gain influence over the state, and they find a suitable context to justify their attacks on the rights of women and LGBTQ plus members of society. And in accepting the realm of nature and biology, women have left themselves open to patriarchal attacks on the grounds of biological difference. Under the conditions in which states' racist agenda has drawn on biological reproduction, this empowered the patriarchal political actors, and they managed to put an end to one of the most significant interventions against gendered violence in Turkey. So, what does the future hold? While the process of de-democratization is not unique to Turkey, but this process increasingly shaped the future of gender regimes in the world. And cisgender heterosexual family structure and gendered violence appear to be maintained in different trajectories of socio-economic transformation. Under such conditions, it is significant to understand the causes of the patriarchal state character, what sustains and what reshapes the patriarchal state character. In the case of Turkey, I see that it's significantly important to establish stronger alliances with the groups that racism targets in the context of Turkey, which are mostly Kurdish and Alevi members of society in Turkey. Also, men of the regime is another particularly significant group of people that any kind of politics in Turkey currently need to consider. So considering their power, we need to acknowledge that they are benefiting from decolonization debate happening in the global north. They are manipulating this debate, and they manage to position themselves as a respectable knowledge production center. They are alternative, but also whatever they produce, which are not actually, we are inaccurate information, spread through their claim of alternative knowledge production. And finally, we need to communicate critical gender knowledge, and de-essentializing sex and gender serves to challenge the naturalized rationale for the male control over women's labor within the determinate set of production relations. It could be within and outside of households. It will challenge the division of labor. And I believe that, I'm out of time, I believe that not only the discourse-based understandings of sex and gender, but also historical materialist interpretations of how social construction of sex and gender would support our attempts to distribute critical gender knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ece. Very interesting and provocative discussion as well. We have now 15 minutes left, so I would ask to the attendees to ask any questions they might want by raising their hands or by typing their questions into the chat box. In the meantime, I might maybe ask questions. I can have maybe I can make an umbrella question about, because we have learned very context specific, but at the same time we can draw many parallelism around these three case studies. So I wanted to ask to Ece and Anjana if you want to reflect a little bit of how these things can move forward in terms of what is the state, because I mean in a way what we are looking here is that the patriarchal regimes of the state, but also of like micro level dynamics. So if you want to reflect a little bit on the parallelism and a little bit of a comparative reflections of these 3 case studies, and how do you see, we can engage in in synergies, and how do we move forward to kind of create categories that can, I mean, obviously we cannot really like expect that universal categories, but in a way expect a frame that, or a kind of a theoretical framework that can help explain us what are the challenges out there in terms of woman emancipation and woman empowerment, and of any kinds of patriarchies. Do you want to, who wants to start? I know it's a very general question, but I thought that it would be worth it to reflect a little bit of beyond the case studies.
Anjana, I can say a few things with my. I mean, Egypt, India are also the countries that I pay special attention to analyze a little bit. So what I find nowadays is, what I find interesting is that this Hindu nationalism and caste-based discrimination in India are these dynamics are very important. So I wouldn't dare to define a racist agenda in India, but there is an interesting form of racism in the global south as well. So the racism in India has different dynamics, and in Turkey it has different dynamics. It targets different groups. But if we refer to Eric Wright's research that Anjana used as well, racism also has some shared characteristics. And under the conditions of increasing de-democratization, is a kind of an electoral de-democratization we are watching. And these forms of racism intertwined with different forms of patriarchy, and there's a mutually shaping relationship. And patriarchal actors have their collective agency to reshape the agendas, states' agendas, but also utilize and adopt those agendas and increase their bargaining capacity. In that respect, anti-democratization in Egypt is also interesting that we need to consider. So what is happening, like oppressed groups, subordinated groups in those countries share significant strategical collaborations with gender and sexuality-based groups in these countries' context, in my opinion, and stronger alliance is very important.
All right, yeah. Anjana, do you want to add something?
Yeah, and I was struck by that even during Ece's very fascinating presentation on how there are so many links between agendas across countries, even though the way that it plays out might be different. For instance, the point that Ece raised about how highly educated women are encouraged to work, whereas relatively lower educated women are encouraged to stay at home. It would actually be the class dynamics play out differently in India because poorer and relatively less educated women have to go out to work because the economic conditions are such that whereas it's the higher class women who can sort of afford to stay at home. So the way that it plays out may be different, but in terms of how agendas, patriarchal agendas and nationalist agendas play out, there are a lot of similarities, and particularly there's of course been a lot of work that relates race and caste and how we can actually see similarities between these structures in spite of the context-specific differences. But yeah, I think the way forward sort of as you were suggesting in your question, Lorena, how we can sort of build an alliance is through recognizing those similarities while being rooted in our context. But yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, Irene is left, but also the material conditions that you described in the case of India, and as you described in the case of Turkey, and Irene has described in the case of, Egypt, I mean, makes like a further point that has been done also in the context of Europe or the US, which like is austerity and the lack of investment in, public services or regulations in job markets. It's basically a sexist policy and a racist policy because it targets the weakest components of the society. So yeah, I totally agree. But yeah, it's very interesting. I don't know if you have, we have a few minutes for any final questions. I know that we have mostly male participants component. I know that there is a school meeting going on at the same time, so I have received some last minute apologize. But if not, I would then thank you very much, Ece, for putting together this amazing panel of speakers, and Anjana for joining us. It's been very fascinating. We hope to get in touch, and we'll organize further reflections on this very, very fundamental topic. And it's very good to make a point that this is also a very interdisciplinary seminar. So we have like different point of views coming together. So
Lorena,
yes.
do we still have 7 minutes?
Yes. So you can use it.
I have
It's
a question
just that I didn't see.
Anjana.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't know that you are closing. So Anjana,
No.
I find your research very interesting. Like your claim that dominant castes, women from dominant castes, benefit from landlessness condition of Dalit women, so they don't join the common movement for land. And actually, when I focus on the case of Turkey, the law which discriminates against women in land inheritance was announced in 1926, and it remained in place until 2015, actually, almost a century. And we did have a very strong feminist movement in those years, beginning and later. But no one has noticed that those women are discriminated against men in land inheritance. So when I try to understand why this is the case, I mostly thought that I found that feminism is very urban in Turkey, and it is including female working class women, female wage workers, and also upper middle class educated women. And they work for their own benefits, and they haven't even noticed that this law is discriminatory. And I was wondering if the dynamics of South and North India are different due to those different aspects of features of feminist movements in India, or I wonder if you considered if there are also this kind of differences. Sorry, let's talk too much.
Yes.
No, thanks, Ece. That is a point. That is an important point, and I'll take that and I'll look more into that. When there have been women's movements in general, there have been movements that have demanded better working conditions or better earnings. So that itself is a question on why not necessarily urban movements, but even movements in rural areas, not necessarily about claiming what is legally allowed to them in terms of inheriting their family property. So that itself was sort of a puzzle to me, that women's movements have not very often raised the demand for land itself or actually gone against their family to claim their rights over property. But yeah, that is an interesting point, and I'll consider that more in terms of regional differences. That's not something that I've explored in the paper. But yeah, in terms of regional differences, that is an interesting point to take into consideration. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess social norms in that sense plays a huge role. I mean, in the context of Uzbekistan as well, we had, we've seen, it's been observed that, I mean, even though legally there is no official discrimination, then there is a tendency to, facilitate those kind of accumulation of land on the male lines. Anjana, do you have a question for Ece, or Ece, you have a further question for Anjana?
I do.
Yes. Go ahead. No, I thought
So interesting.
We didn't have questions because we were all silent. Okay.
So, Anjana, when I look at the Turkish law, the dynamics which created this discriminatory law, it was interestingly kind of a socialist movement. So they decided that a land under a certain scale cannot be divided. So it needs to be passed directly one of the sons or daughters of the person. And then they decided that sons should have the land rather than daughters. And they wanted to defend this indivisible land in order to keep the welfare of peasants high. So when I look at the case of India, I found that Ambedkar, initially, he is the one who said that indivisible land shouldn't be divided. It should pass to sons. And I find it striking that all these kind of in Turkey left-leaning, and in India, I don't know if you would call Ambedkar socialist, but he is a very well accepted left leader. They reshaped the law, inheritance law, in a way which is discriminating against women. And in that point, because this land is land of poor people, oppressed people, like you say, lower caste people, like indivisible land is a so small subsistence farming land. And I was wondering if middle class, upper class women or women from higher castes in those years align with their demand and they allowed those women to be discriminated, which would support your hypothesis.
So I'm not sure of the position of dominant caste women at that time, but yeah, I should definitely explore that. In terms of farm sizes and why the land shouldn't be divided, in fact, there was this debate around farm sizes and productivity on how smaller farm sizes can actually be more productive. So there was a whole debate around it in the 1960s and 70s. But in general, the overall point that I would try to take away from it would be that without a division of productive resources, it would be difficult to even reach equality in terms of gender. So without a division of productive resources across households of different communities, so even when we're thinking of redistributing land in favor of women, we would need to take into account the fact that even women are not the same or they're not homogeneous. So we would need to think of social justice in terms of distribution of productive resources if we want to think of gendered justice. So that was the overall point. Yeah, I will look more into the historical consequences of what happened when legislations were passed around. So the original Amendment Act was actually in 1956 and was amended in 2005 and made more progressive in terms of women's inheritance over family property. But I will look more into how dominant caste women may have responded in those situations. This is more of a present context, but you're right that it's certainly interesting how they might have responded to it at the time that the act was proposed or the amendment was proposed.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks a lot, Anjana and Ece. Yeah, we are closing now. So this was the last seminar of the year. So we'll see you next academic year, hopefully. And thanks again for joining us for these very interesting presentations.